that we are kind of addressing ourselves tonight to the issue of how philanthropy can or doesn't advance those kinds of values is a really important debate for us. So we're delighted, Mike, that you're here, Matthew, that you're here. And as a special treat, as our moderator, we have Betsy Campbell. Betsy is the Vice President for Programs at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, whose President, Stephen Heinz, is our board chair. She is providing leadership to the grants research and grant-making, the fund's research and grant-making activities. Before that, she spent 20 years in the field of international relations, working in a consulting firm in Bolivia, her own firm. Prior to that, she served at the Ford Foundation and the Asset and Community Development Foundation, and also did work for the Save the Children Federation. So Betsy is a person who's extremely knowledgeable on philanthropy, international relations, civil society, and we are delighted to have her introducing and moderating our program. Betsy Campbell.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you to Demos for having us all here this evening and figuring out how to get so many people in a small room reasonably comfortably. So, nice work, and thank you for having us. Tonight's topic, the future of philanthropy. Can market-based solutions save the world? Who knew it would fill a room, right? When was the last time that you got this many people in a room to talk about philanthropy? So thank you for being here, and I'm sure that a lot of this has to do with the speakers that we have with us tonight, and I will turn to them in just a moment. But I'm also sure that a number of you are here tonight because you either work in foundations, or you are activists or analysts or academics who think about the role of philanthropy in society. This debate about the role of business in philanthropy and the role of philanthropy more broadly is a debate, and a set of questions that emerge from the debate are alive and well across foundations. And I can speak certainly from the foundation that I currently represent, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We spend a lot of time with our board and among staff thinking about how we can best position the Rockefeller Brothers Fund's resources to enhance and, when necessary, challenge the work of the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector. So figuring out the balance, the relationships, and the best work of those three sectors is one of the questions that I'm sure our speakers will get to tonight. We're also asked by our boards, and we demand of ourselves the articulation of clear goals and strategies, so grant seekers know what our sort of sense of vision is and our sense of the challenges we face in society. And then we're left with the task of how do we know when we're making progress? And again, I'm sure our speakers will get to questions of measuring results, of milestones or benchmarks. There's a lot of terminology that goes along with this. And embedded in all of this terminology is a real challenge of understanding how it is we can be catalytic in terms of the social change we all know is so desperately needed in so many areas, and at the same time know we're making progress and get to the next place in an effective way. The other issues that come up are attribution and claiming credit. It's really nice to be able to go to your board and say, we made this grant and all these good things happen, but we all know that it takes so many institutions and so many different players to move the needle in the directions that we are seeking. And so we run into problems of time frame, attribution, accountability, meaningful accountability for the kinds of efforts we make to steward private resources for public good. So we are really so fortunate to have with us tonight two of the foremost writers and thinkers on civil society and philanthropy. Michael Edwards, as Miles noted, is a distinguished senior fellow here at Demos, author of the newly published Small Change, Why Business Won't Save the World. I think we know where he stands. He is also currently a senior visiting scholar at the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU. and is affiliated with the Brooks World Poverty Institute at Manchester University in the UK. Michael and I were actually colleagues at the Ford Foundation overlapping a number of years. He was there from 99 to 2008 as the director of the Ford Foundation's Governance and Civil Society program. Prior to that, had affiliations with the World Bank, Oxfam, Save the Children, any number of NGOs in Washington, London, internationally in Colombia, Zambia, Malawi, and India. Matthew Bishop is the New York bureau chief for The Economist and previously served as its London-based business editor and has written the book Capitalism: How Giving Can Save the World. So we also have a sense of where he's coming from. And actually, I think the term philanthrocapitalism, I didn't know I would ever get to meet the guy that coined it. So I'm really, really delighted to be here because it really has come to describe at least one way of approaching the kinds of philanthropic activity that so many of us think about and are engaged in. Matthew has also recently, or is about to publish a book, I think it comes out maybe next week or so, The Road from Ruin, How to Revive Capitalism and Put America Back on Top. Really glad you're here thinking about how we can do that too. Matthew has also played an important role through his venue at The Economist in promoting a number of special survey supplements, including The Business of Giving. And I saw this description which referred to this as a look at the industrial revolution taking place in philanthropy. It's a little hard for me to say that without wanting to really get into a long conversation about what that is, but we'll talk about that later, I hope. Here's how we're going to run this evening. I will turn it to first Mike and then Matthew. Each of them will take about 10 minutes to lay out their case, in a sense, the kind of perspective they bring to this discussion and how they came to it and where they think we're headed. I'll try to hold them to about that time because we have a great crowd this evening and we'd really like to turn it into a discussion. And I'll try to play a role of organizing some questions from all of you, hoping that we will all engage each other in what will surely be a good discussion. Mike.
Well, thanks very much, Betsy. It's great to be reunited with you again after all those years, and thanks to Demos for organising this. Thanks to Matthew. He has an incredibly busy schedule, so it's great that he's spared time to be with us tonight. He's actually a tough but friendly adversary, so I'm looking forward to another round. We call this round 4, is that right? Round 5 is going to be in March, and then we'll have 6, 7, and 8 later in the year. Over the last few years, it's almost become an article of faith that not-for-profit organisations and the philanthropic system that supports them should operate more on business principles, meaning rates of return, competition to weed out the weak performers, close supervision, perhaps even control over the organisations that you fund, like a venture capitalist, standardised indicators of outputs as success measures and so on. And Matthew, as Betsy said, is the person who christened this movement philanthrocapitalism. Just in case you felt you didn't have enough business influence in your lives already, through politics, healthcare, education, the media, government, now it's civil society's turn. Civil society simply means the ways in which citizens organise themselves for collective action in their communities and beyond. Come on in, guys. We know you're here to help. President Obama said last week in a different context that the banks in America don't need another vote in the US Senate, since they have plenty already. And that just about sums up, I guess, my view on this debate too. Why would you give business more influence in society by commercialising philanthropy and eroding practically the only places left where we can still be equal and create solutions together which are not dependent on purchasing power or the zero-sum games of the marketplace? I win, you lose. Places where we can be full and active citizens, not clients or consumers. Now, as my mother used to tell me, I'm not as stupid as I look. So I know that approach can really help. For example, if I want to get more efficient cooking stoves to African villages or microcredit loans to the poor, I would have to harness the power of the market in order to reach as many people as possible at a price point they could afford and still make a decent profit so that that process can continue to expand. And in doing that, business expertise, I would imagine, would be essential. And every organisation needs strong financial systems and the like that we can learn from businesses, like Lehman Brothers, AIG, Bear Stearns, and the rest. But creating markets, even for socially and environmentally useful goods and services like those, is obviously only part of the picture of social change. And buying and selling things is not actually what citizens' groups are well designed for. So as a general principle, or as a philosophy, I think philanthrocapitalism is a bit like Elvis or James Dean. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. It's mad because, believe it or not, there's no evidence to support the claim that a business approach to social change is any better outside the areas that I mentioned. Not a shred. There's no logic to back it up unless you believe that social transformation is simply another product to be packaged and sold in the marketplace, or that it's possible to calculate the rate of return on courage or compassion or love or health of the community, or that the messiness and the conflict and the politics of the world can somehow be removed or avoided by using a calculator and a spreadsheet. It's bad because it erodes the independence of the non-profit world, the independence that they need to hold business and government accountable for their actions and push them constantly to do things they don't want to do. It threatens the distinctive values of civil society, which are based on cooperation and commitment, not the ethics of the marketplace. Values that have spurred the creation of social movements from the abolition of slavery to pro-democracy demonstrations in Iran. It privatises the way we solve social problems, and it gives too much power to the public, as when big foundations decide how our schools should be reformed. And it allows businesses off the hook by pretending that they can increase their social impact by reforming others instead of transforming their own core practices. You can create lucrative monopolies, engage in wage theft, avoid your taxes, and so on, but you'll still be praised for being a philanthropist, as long as you give some of those billions back. But wouldn't it be nice if business fixed itself instead of meddling with others? That would actually make a huge contribution to the common good by expanding the ownership of wealth and wealth-creating opportunities and altering governance and accountability of corporations. In that sense, as I put it in the book, real change will come when business acts more like civil society, not the other way around. Most insidious of all, I think, philanthrocapitalism is dangerous to know because it's so seductive, with its mantra of doing well for others while doing well for yourself. It's a promise of gain without pain, progress without sacrifice, empowerment without politics, and social change without complexity or struggle. A comforting mirage, which acts as a brake against more radical and personally demanding solutions. And in place of argument and negotiation about what is good and socially valuable, arguments, let's face it, that lie at the very heart of democracy, philanthrocapitalism offers a supposedly universal set of metrics to guide decision-making that brook no disagreement. Either it's better or worse, $1.50 or $1.49. Democracy is reduced to a choice between competing charity brands, signified by clicking your mouse on a website, like Kiva or Global Giving. Civil society is reduced to a subset of the marketplace, stripped of its social and political significance. And philanthropy is reduced to a control system, not a support system for deep-rooted social change. Welcome to the path of least resistance, perfectly suited to our consumer culture, when what we desperately need is a revival of mass-based civic activism to do the hard work of animating democracy in search of the public good. What I call citizen philanthropy in the book, although that's not my name, but it's a good label to distinguish what I'm talking about from philanthrocapitalism, because real change happens when large numbers of low-income and other disadvantaged people gain enough traction to alter the rules of the game, the whole way in which our economic and political systems work. This Monday, as you know, is Martin Luther King Day. And it's interesting to speculate how the philanthrocapitalists would have treated him. and the civil rights movement that he led. I was actually at a service in Harlem with my wife Cora, who's here somewhere in the audience, where the pastor reminded us that many people tried to persuade King at the time to abandon the Montgomery bus boycott that had been sparked by the bravery of Rosa Parks. You will remember that. On the grounds that it would lose their churches and their charities too much money in donations, the ultimate negative rate of return, if you will. But because they ignored that advice and the narrow economic calculus on which it was based, they went on to change the world forever. What happened there, just as what happened on the streets of Tehran last year, or what's happening today in the rubble of Haiti, has nothing to do with rates of return, or data-driven performance, or any of the other gobbledygook of philanthrocapitalism. It's an expression of the transformative power of the human spirit, acting collectively for a higher purpose. That's what philanthropy should be supporting. We erode that spirit at our peril, and that's why the stakes in this debate are so very high. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. It's always fun to debate with you. It's nice to be abused before you get up and speak. Michael actually did that because he actually wrote his initial draft of this book before my book appeared, launching a preemptive strike based on no knowledge of what would actually be in the book, a strategy that he's pursued ever since in bad-mouthing philanthrocapitalism. You mentioned James Dean and Elvis Presley in your introductory remarks. I think, in a sense, you're a rebel without a cause, and Elvis has left the building. They're really... What you are criticising is not what I'm writing about, and let me just tell you what that is. We are not saying, in Michael Greene and I in this book, that philanthropy should be run as a business. We're saying that there's lots to learn from the business world about effectiveness. The book came about really out of the experience of me as a journalist, having lots of conversations in a very non-ideological way, noticing something going on that seemed to me important, asking questions, following my nose, and finding that there was a movement taking place that got me excited, and I wanted to share some of that excitement. And it's been quite clear to me that a lot of people have responded very well to that excitement. There have been people who are, great people with tremendous influence and careers. Bill Clinton, for example, who's written the foreword to the paperback edition of the book, which he describes as an important book, because it does the thing that he was most looking for when he was struggling in office, in government, trying to deal with the problems of government. It sets out some ideas about what works. And after all, as pragmatic people trying to make our way in solving the world's great problems, we want to know what works, not what fits our ideological prejudices. But it's not just the people like Bill Clinton or Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, who also has been a great encourager of this book and quite understands that we're not arguing for turning charities into businesses, as he writes in his special addition to his book Good to Great in the social sector. The last thing you want to be doing is importing thoughtlessly business methods into the social sector. Or it's been I think to me I think one of the most touching and exciting things about being an author is when someone comes up to you and says, you've changed my life, this book is my Bible. And that experience happened to me the other week with a lovely couple in their 60s called the Aldermans, who lost their son in the World Trade Center disaster and decided to use the compensation they received not to do something here in New York, but actually to provide, to set up a charity that is focused on helping those who are mentally traumatized in war zones to come back to better mental health. And they're working with Paul Farmer of partners in health, and they're very closely involved with the government and other organizations in Uganda. And they invited me out to lunch, and they said, "This is my Bible, can you sign the book?" And they showed me at the back of the book just page after page of notes they'd taken from the book, of things that had meant something to them that they'd taken away and applied to making their organization more effective. And then there's people like Raj Shah, who's the new head of USAID, who I got to know when he was working at the Gates Foundation. And, he's now dealing, I guess, with the US government's response to what's going on in Haiti at the moment. And he is someone who has been very much shaped by the experience of working in the Gates Foundation, trying to figure out how do we look at all the people struggling to survive in the small farming communities of Africa and the developing world, where they're excluded from global markets, they're struggling to achieve subsistence. And he was doing a lot of work first on microfinance. How do we take microfinance to the next level? And then he was looking at the issue of, well, one of the biggest problems that these subsistence farmers face is the supply chain to the marketplace just doesn't work. And so he really focused on, well, what can we do as a foundation? How do we get businesses and others to share some of their knowledge to improve the effectiveness of the supply chains, to effectively take out a lot of the profit that the middlemen are taking from the system, and to allow people with very small amounts of land and animals and things to actually earn a decent living, to provide them with insurance against their biggest risk, which is a bad weather shock that upsets their harvest and so forth, or the loss of an animal. A very practical person. Or, I also, again think of another person who loved the book, who's Charles Best. I don't know if you know Charles Best. Charles Best founded something called DonorsChoose. DonorsChoose is an organisation. He was a teacher up in Harlem, and realised that they hadn't got enough money to fund some of the projects the teachers wanted to do. They were sitting around in the classroom, and they said, well, why don't we find a way to raise money for teachers who have projects that they don't have a budget to fund? And they've set up a website called DonorsChoose. DonorsChoose, you just go there, you use your mouse, which I know Michael finds a disgusting capitalist activity, and you basically go to your mouse and you find a message. You have a whole list of teachers putting projects up, and there's a little thing that counts how much money people have donated to that project, and you can put some of your own money into that project, and if enough money is raised, the project happens. The teacher sends you a thank you message, and maybe the kids will write you a letter as well, saying how much they've benefited and appreciated your generosity, which sounds like a fantastic civil society activity to me that's brought people really close together. And DonorsChoose has now used all sorts of terrible business methods, like using search technology and smart technology, smart software to figure out if you've made donations before on their site, so what you chose before, what sort of projects appealed to you, where you're living, so that they can kind of flash up the right sort of projects that they think might appeal to you, to sort of hook you in. It's all very clever and businesslike. And they've raised many, many tens of millions of dollars that have benefited hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children all over America. What they've done is they've also got into bed with big business and some powerful donors and celebrities, philanthropists, people like Stephen Colbert, who's a big fan on their board. But they've also had donors who've said to them, well, actually, we love this idea so much. Why don't you give out some gift cards with our money and to people and get them to come and use the site and see it for themselves? And I've got a whole box of them here. So anyone that wants $25, this is the most shameless way to win a debate, I hope. I've got about 60 cards here that you can just simply go. It has to be used by February the 15th. Go to DonorsChoose there's a number on the card, and there's $25 to give to help children in America. I personally don't find this too upsetting, and I think you'll find lots of examples in the book of things like that. I basically believe this doesn't fit neatly into our ideological boxes. It's about the head and the heart, the business world and the social sector, the civil sector coming together in ways that are quite new. We're all trying to figure it out as we go along. I think my book is providing a very detailed and accurate and fascinating account of what's going on through, admittedly, the perspective of a number of these very wealthy business people. There are lots of ethical issues the thing raises. We do need to debate it. I think this is why it's great that we are having these conversations. But I think, compared to the caricature of capitalists that we've seen in terms of the Wall Streeters that are doing God's work, or the models that were talked about by Reagan and Thatcher 20 years ago, we're in a very different world, and it's a world that I think is much more focused on these huge ethical challenges and how we can all work together in different partnerships to actually do, as President Clinton says, what works rather than what makes us feel ideologically comfortable. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you both. I want to turn it to questions in the audience and to really turn this into a discussion as much as we can do that. I'm afraid we're at a little disadvantage. I doubt those of you in the back can actually see Michael and Matthew up here. Am I right about that? They're out of sight. So,
We'll wave.
Yeah, okay. So we may end up standing up, or I'll move out of the way. And yeah, we can just sort of stand here just so you can see them. But let me turn it to the audience, and we've got one question right here.
Yeah, hi. So I'm fascinated by the topic. And
Excuse me, could I just, Miles reminded me, could you just say your name and where you're from so that we have a sense of you? Yeah, and I think standing up would be great.
Who started? I come at this as a fundraiser, so I've worked with philanthropists, foundations, individuals who are on the giving, I work with to help sort of advance their objectives towards a social good.
Get the microphone. Okay. So I've seen it from that angle, and then I'm a consultant now, and I work with individuals who are using business approaches like investing and using that to deploy not towards a private company, but money that's used towards affordable housing and microfinance, whatever. So I've seen the benefits, of that. I guess the real question that I have, so I've seen sort of both sides. I'm very compelled by the notion of philanthrocapitalism, but I think your intro is really interesting and brings up a lot of compelling notions. The main thing I think that would be very helpful is this idea of philanthrocapitalism or what you talk about, Mike. I think it would be helpful if we had some framework of what are we talking about? What is the definition? Because, if you're talking about a business approach, I don't think many of us would fight that. And I think that's what I took away from what you were just talking about is a business discipline, that we look at this, because I've worked with many philanthropists, as probably many of us in the room have, who, will go with an organization because it's a cute look or, someone said they're doing good work. And I think it's fantastic in the 20 years that I've been working in this field to see individuals, foundations say, no, it's not about the cute little kid on the postcard or what my friend tells me. It's about some rigor. It's about some discipline of where I can really have impact and what are the measures. And we've gotten a little crazy with the measures and all. So I think it would be helpful. That's my very long way of saying it would be just useful to know as a starting point. And I think you even kind of both said, you see parts of where the business approach is useful in a market situation, but not. So maybe just I don't know if it's a definition or just a starting place to see what we're really, if we agree or not, because I don't really know. Right. When I hear this both, I get a little more confused than not. Does that make sense in terms of a starting place?
Let me make a suggestion. What I want to do in general is look for clusters of themes, but I actually think that the question that you raise is sort of basically, could you help us by ticking off some key features of the distinctive perspectives and approaches you're talking about? So maybe I could ask each of you just to respond to that question. In general, though, I am going to try to see if we can cluster a few questions and then turn it into a bit of a back and forth and round dialogue. So, or Matthew, you want to go first and maybe lay out some of the key principles that...
This is the man with the definition.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, is that on? No? There isn't a very precise definition of philanthrocapitalism, which I guess is maybe why it gets misunderstood. Well, it is really what it purports to be, which is the word philanthropy and the word capitalism being slammed together. It's saying that we shouldn't keep thinking these two worlds in their different boxes, that effectiveness, which is really what I think we're all interested in, is solving these problems, is better done through bringing the different sectors together, through not segmenting all the do-gooding off in a way that isn't disciplined and focused on outcomes, not letting ourselves caricature business as this sort of evil, selfish world, but actually trying to figure out what partnerships, what different organisations work well together, how do we structure partnerships that play to the strengths of the different parts of society. And as I say, the words came out of seeing what was going on and seeing these promising developments. I certainly am not defining philanthrocapitalism as turning philanthropy into a business, which I think is what Michael's definition of it veers towards.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll say three quick things. First, on where Matthew left off, my understanding is broader than that, but it does include importing formal business techniques and market methods into the world of philanthropy, into grant making. But I think the wider definition, which is maybe a bit more useful than what I use in my book, Small Change, is simply using capitalism for philanthropic ends, because that opens up a whole set of ideas around social enterprise, corporate social responsibility, social entrepreneurs, new business models, and so on. Philanthropy is one of those. But I think that, and Matthew is right here, that's the centre of the debate now. There are radically different views of it, but it is a debate on how to reform or transform capitalism in order to change its social and economic costs and benefits. The second thing is it's very important, I think, to make a clear distinction between what people call business thinking and the ideology of the market, because they are or they can be quite different. I am much more fearful of the ideology of the market than I am in terms of business thinking, because many people, when they say those words, simply mean being professional or organised or disciplined in the way you go about your job, which is a fact of life for most people in the non-profit sector too. And it brings up the interesting question of what is so unique about businesses that we recommend them by rote in that way, because we've all seen how businesses can be appallingly mismanaged. So the important thing for me there is not to conflate good management with business, because good management comes from everywhere and good managers take from everywhere, and that's how they improve themselves. So we have to start separating business from broad-based capacities, if you like, and skills, where we could actually have a much more useful conversation. The final thing is we had to remember even more deeply that the original meaning of philanthropy has nothing to do with any of this stuff. Philanthropy means love of humankind. Amazing how we've lost that spirit in our discussions about money, because basically that's what philanthropy has become. A discussion about money. Money in the public interest, money in the public good, that's fine. But why don't we take back that older tradition, which is much more liberating, and will get us much closer to solving the problems that we face.
Good. Let me take a couple of questions here and see if they make a theme.
I'm Michael Seltzer. I've been in the nonprofit sector and foundations and nonprofits for 42 years. I've been enamored of late looking at social movements as the real vehicles for social change. And Michael is a kind of a counterpoint to your story about Martin Luther King, I fear if we had asked him to fill out a logic model or a theory of change or even to put forward a grant proposal. And I'm worried about, as we think about really affecting change, are we really talking about social movements rather than nonprofits? I mean, nonprofits, for many of us in the room, we were spawned off of social movements, and somehow we allowed the IRS to define us. How does this, what you're talking about today, how does this relate to, I think we would agree that we wouldn't be as far advanced as we are without social movements. So is there a relationship between, either positive or negative, between how either you define philanthrocapitalism and supporting social movements?
Are there any other questions that relate pretty directly to this one? Yeah, why don't I go right here?
Yes, Julie Picior, Manhattan College. Before I heard that question, I was going to ask about a social movement in relation to capitalism sectors and nonprofits, and that is the labor movement. And it strikes me that Dr. King, this never gets talked about at Dr. King's anniversary, some of you know where I'm going, that when he died, he was supporting a strike. Is the labor movement irrelevant? Is it passé? Is it an obstacle? Or is it important?
Any other questions that sort of relate to the relationship, social movements, social change, capitalism? There's a couple right back there. Yeah.
Hi, Laurie Basel, the Edward Hazen Foundation. And it relates to what Michael was saying because when I heard your comments about DonorsChoose, it evoked in me what is clearly a transactional relationship, which to me is not a civil society kind of activity as you seem to be saying it was, and certainly not a movement building or collective activity, which I think is the kind of language that is on the other side of this debate. And ultimately, we in foundations have this dilemma where we are in a transactional relationship generally, and we are the buyers in a buyer's market. We have power, and if our interest is in funding real movement building, collective action, the voice of people most affected by the issue, defining the issue and changing it, how do we limit that power in a way that makes a productive relationship? That's my struggle in this.
Okay. I'm going to take one more question here, and then we'll go back around, but the woman in the yellow right there, yeah.
Hi, I'm Bonnie McEwan. I teach in the nonprofit management program at the New School. Going along with this idea of foundations, I think it's appropriate to provide scrutiny to business and to nonprofits, but I also think we ought to scrutinize foundations and their ways of work. And Michael mentioned logic models, and there is this issue very tactically about how foundations fund, who they fund, what level of control they seem to feel they should have over the grantees, and who really is the expert and all of that. So I think that's part of this whole piece. Foundations, where are they in this cycle of becoming more effective?
Right, good. So why don't we cluster those up, and then Michael, you want to lead off this time?
Sure, thanks. Well, they do fit together. And the way I would answer all of them as a group is, first of all, to say that in my own thinking, I always think of civil society as an ecosystem. Just like a natural ecosystem, which to be healthy requires an enormous diversity of plants and animals in relationship with each other. They're mutually dependent. So you need trade unions, labor unions, you need social movements, but you also need think tanks and intermediaries and specialist funding bodies and service providers and so on. And a healthy civil society is one where all of those are represented and they're articulated with each other, so everyone's voice is heard, everyone's needs are met, and the whole functions more than the sum of its parts. But you're right that some elements of that ecosystem in practical terms have been somewhat lost sight of in the funding community, partly because it's more difficult to fund social movements and labour unions because they're a bit bolshy, is the word that I remember being raised. They ask too many questions, they don't follow the rules, they don't fill out the logic models and so on. So they sort of don't qualify. Whereas a big intermediary NGO or non-profit, it's easy. It has 15 grant writers and they can turn a proposal around quickly. So there is a disadvantage there, and that feeds through into some real problems because the poorer your ecosystem, the less likely it is to solve the really big problems in society. So you're right to raise those issues. The second point is that as in a real ecosystem, different kinds of organisation need different kinds of funding, different kinds of revenue. And my concern in this debate is that we're forgetting that and pretending that, if you like, business-oriented, commercial revenue generation, rates of return and so on, which are appropriate to one particular sector of the ecosystem, are being generalised for everyone with very damaging consequences. So it's not the fact that these things are generally wrong, but they're only appropriate for a certain sector of organisations. But we seem to lose sight of that. And thirdly and finally, there is a whole set of emerging traditions in philanthropy which are trying to be more supportive of the kinds of organisations people are talking about. Horizontal philanthropy, it's being called, community-based philanthropy, mutual solidarity and funding, membership donations, the work of Bill Somerville and his colleagues on the West Coast, who has no strings attached to funds, simply gives to people he thinks are doing interesting work and are authentic in their communities, and they get on with it, is very successful. So there are lots of different models of philanthropy which can be appropriate to different circumstances, but our debate has become reduced in the way that we're thinking about today, and that is a real problem. That's not an accusation, you know, a mark of blame about who has done it, who is responsible for it. But I do think we need a more ecumenical and democratic debate where all the options and all the possibilities are equally represented.
Matthew, you want to make a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent, I mean, my view is let a thousand flowers bloom. I'm not knocking anybody else's activities when they come together to collaborate around a solution to a problem or whatever they want to do in their community. Social movements, you go back, one of the things we did in writing our book was to look at the history of philanthropy, and we went back to several golden ages of philanthropy, one of which was in the late 18th century in Britain, where one of the greatest achievements was the abolition of the slave trade, which was a social movement that relied very heavily on the financing of some Christian evangelical who put a lot of money behind William Wilberforce, who campaigned on that issue and eventually got the law changed. I think very much a role model for some of the mass social movements that we see today, and they, among other things, this group of wealthy philanthropists tried to create countries for freed slaves to go and live in. So both Liberia and Sierra Leone came out of that, and they turned out to be fairly disastrous experiments as it went out. But then eventually they changed the law, and this was, I mean, I think a direct equivalent to the idea of the Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, the slave trade was a massive, dominant capitalistic business in Britain and the world at that time, and this was a group of wealthy people who funded a movement designed to kill that trade. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything inevitable about being on one side of the equation. Today we see the One campaign, which Bono is very associated with, around debt relief and so forth. I mean, his organisation, One, was seed funded, as we write in the book, by Bill Gates, George Soros, and a guy called Ed Scott, who were three very wealthy people, and then John Doerr, Silicon Valley venture capitalist, also put several $1 million into the organisation, and it's been run very much as a business campaigning, lobbying organisation, but has very much had as one of its goals fostering a social movement. George Soros, another person we write about in the book, has played a huge role in promoting open society around the former Soviet Union, in other parts of the world, and indeed here through his early funding of MoveOn.org. So, I mean, I just don't think there's anything inevitable about which side of the fence the philanthrocapitalists are going to come down on. In the early part of the 20th century, the big foundations of the day invested a lot of money in doing some of the pioneering research into the causes of poverty and racism in America. The founders of Goldman Sachs actually were early funders of the NAACP, as was the founder of Sears. So there's just nothing inevitable about which side of the fence they are. Jeff Skoll, I think, the first chief executive of eBay, is really one of the most far-thinking people in terms of how do you take social movements to the next level of effectiveness through combining movies like An Inconvenient Truth with real-time interactivity, using cell phones to sign up and text, become parts of movements, and then link in with practical organisations on the ground. So, I think the potential is that, for social movements to be much, much more effective than they've ever been through the use of this kind of new technology and the capital that some of the philanthropic capitalists are putting to work. Even the labour movement, which I think, probably has played a hugely important role at certain times in the development of the economy, is probably not doing a very good job at the moment, and new models of the labour movement are needed. Well, the one organisation that's really impressed me in the last few years has been the Freelancers Union, which is a union that doesn't try and keep people in their same job for the rest of their life despite the industry they're in going out of business, but actually is about supporting and providing healthcare and other basic services to freelancers who now account for a large part of the population. That is an organisation that receives seed funding from echoing Greene, which was funded by private equity guys in General Atlantic, and has been helped to be developed by Ashoka, which has received money from the founders of eBay and other organisations. So, I just think that to sort of try and create this this sense that people with money can't play a constructive role in social movements is just, shooting yourself in the foot and missing a very powerful source of strength in civil society that ought to be tapped into rather than shouted at and abused.
Thank you. You know what I'd like to do is, well, go ahead.
I don't think personally, I'm sorry, but I work at Fort a mental health clinic in the Bronx as a clinician. Anyway, I did used to work for an arts foundation several years ago, but I never was under the impression that business wasn't a part. I mean, philanthropists historically have money. I mean, you're giving a list of all the, the People magazine of all these philanthropists, but of course they should be. They should be acting like responsible citizens and using their money for good. I think the importance is that business is at the service of philanthropy and not the other way around. And calling something philanthrocapitalism rings a lot of bells. It may sell books, but it's a real trigger, and I think it's misleading.
With the same idea that, beyond all the... If we're staying within the theme of everything, with the questions. So my name is Victor. I live in Queens, New York, and I've volunteered at food pantries, and that's probably my only experience with philanthropy. But to be under the name-dropping anecdotes, I think business has breeded the characters in which you're describing Mike's argument is, and not his analogies. And I have to agree with what Kathy's saying in that same theme, that where does, beyond, obviously, capital injected into any sort of philanthropy will help, but, where does your argument stand beyond this name-dropping and anecdotal stuff, kind of? Sorry.
What I wanted to do also was maybe go back to Mike, because I just to clarify one thing, because I think there are a couple of levels here. There's where does the money come from, and is that at issue or not? And what's the institutional vehicle that manages it, and what kind of discipline, practice, what you want to call it, they use to figure out where to deploy those resources. And then it's about what really is the vision for what's happening on the ground and what's going to make for social change. And we probably even you need to ask the question is, are we talking about the same thing, or we're talking about social change on the ground? So I wanted to go back to you and ask you if actually part of your thinking is, in fact, that there's a problem in terms of where the resources come from, because I don't know what you think about that.
Much less of a problem, because as people are saying, philanthropy is, as we now think of it, giving money for social purposes. Unless one objects to that in principle, it would be a bit silly to focus the debate there. So the real debate is about your levels 2 and 3. What are the mechanisms through which money is channeled to different strategies, and what are the strategies, and are they effective or not? And I still think that our universe of possibilities has become has shrunk over the last 5 or 6 years, and has become far too dominated by one particular model, which I understand as philanthrocapitalism. We can argue about that. And when I hear Matthew or Bill Clinton say, we don't have an ideology, there are no conflicts here, we just have to do what works, I sort of feel like running out of the room screaming, because this is such a ridiculous thing to say. Because what does that mean? What works? Who decides? On what criteria? Who has the power to make one vision of that a reality over another? There is nothing that works independently of ideology. We carry ideology in our heads all the time as our frame for interpreting the world and our role in it. What we have to be is to be honest about what our ideology is, and then we can have a conversation.
Matthew, you want to add to that?
Name-dropping anecdotes. I mean, I would call those evidence. I mean, it's sort of lots and lots. I mean, I just think there are not many social movements that have been effective that haven't had, the support of enlightened members of the wealthy over the years. And I think the question that really interests me is, how do we actually make this process work more effectively? It does come down to, I guess, underlying the notion of philanthrocapitalism is a sense that philanthropy on its own was not doing a very good job. It was less effective than it could be. That capitalism on its own was not doing a very good job, that it could be better, and that both of them had something to learn from each other, and that actually also government, which I guess I would have made the word even more unpronounceable, philanthrocapitalism or something, that would have actually, that government was probably even more of a problem, because at least philanthropy and business work to some extent, but government seemed to be almost, we seem to have discovered over the experience of the 20th century that democracy is very good in all sorts of ways, but it seemed to giving government a monopoly of solving social problems, as was increasingly the model certainly in Europe and to a lesser extent in America, really got you into problems that you locked in things, that it was very hard to innovate. There were all sorts of promises made that groups coalesced around to lock in, and that actually those that were on the side of change and experimentation and innovation found it much harder to get access to resources and opportunity. And if you compared that to the business world over the last 25 years, I mean, as we've seen, that business has been far and away far more effective in terms of innovating new things that work, that we love to use, that we incorporate in our lives, than government has been. And so, I think it's encouraging that the Obama administration has got, people working at it in almost every department. It's got a White House Office of Social Innovation. It's got the Education Department has a philanthropic coordinator to work with people who are doing charter school reforms and other things. That we've got the State Department's now got a organisation that is about partnerships with business and philanthropy. That Raj Shah is going to bring that philosophy into USAID. This all seems to me to be improving how the system works. I guess your point on ideology, I mean, I do, accept that obviously you can't be completely ideologically free. I guess I would probably sign up to a fairly similar progressive agenda to you in terms of what problems I'm concerned to solve. Where I'm non-ideological is on how we solve them. That's probably I probably have very strong disagreements with Glenn Beck or someone on what agenda I want, and that might well be an ideological disagreement. But I don't really care about who is doing the solving as long as we solve these problems.
Okay, let me go here and then there and then over here. So.
My name is Amy. I also My name is Amy. I'm coming here also as a fundraiser and a consultant, both to foundations and to nonprofits. One of the joys and one of the frustrations of sitting here listening to you two gentlemen is that I think I'm listening to a theorist or perhaps a linguist debating someone who's a sociologist, where we're talking about what is versus what the ramifications of the theoretical underpinnings of that might be. And so towards that, and I guess I would ask, to what extent maybe the language that we use when we talk about philanthrocapitalism is in fact an outgrowth of the rise of a certain political frame. Certainly in the United States, I can't comment on other places, that started perhaps with Reagan or maybe with Thatcher. Maybe it was a different kind of trickle down. That where we in fact have this uplift of the free market as the source of wisdom. And in fact, whether or not the effect of that period of the past 20 years or so, where we have this huge concentration of wealth, is in fact what gave rise to the use of capitalist language to even almost justify or engage people who have been brought up within that mindset to engage in something that didn't fit into that framework, that would have required a different way of thinking or a different way of being in the world. So I would wonder if you two could comment on that, please.
Okay. Let me go back. There was a hand back here.
Thank you. My name is also Amy. I work with the New York Community Trust. And my question is practical and very New York based, which is, right now we're seeing a lot of social service organizations as well as arts and health providers facing increased demand for services with a shrinking supply of funding from government, from individuals, from foundations. In addition, we have around 40,000 nonprofits based here in New York City, and we're going to be seeing some of those dissolve. And I'm wondering, with both of your approaches, how do you see what is the optimal outcome from this economic crisis? If we do end up with fewer nonprofits, how are those nonprofits going to still provide the services that people need here in the city? And the role of both municipal, we can go up to federal and state government, in providing those services if nonprofits can't.
Great. And there was one more back here I was going to take, and then I'm going to try to figure out a way to make all these the same theme. So, yes, I'm sorry. Nora, was your name? Yeah.
My name is Nora McKeon, and I'm coming at this debate from a slightly different angle, because despite the fact that I'm American, born and educated, I've been working for the past 30 years in FAO, in managing the interface between the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and society, small farmers organizations, artisanal fisherfolk, etc. And to my mind, there is absolutely no doubt but that the problem is not money. It's interesting to hear Mike say that philanthropy, in fact, I'm sorry I didn't study Greek, I got as far as Latin, is not about money to begin with, and I think that's an interesting thing. It's not, in the first case, about money, and it's not about technology. It's not about doing things right. It's about building the political clout of the populations who are not marginal. They're 80%, 90% of the populations of the countries of the South, so that they can engage their governments and obtain accountability of their governments to the needs and the interests of these societies. And it's frightening to me, and I repeat, I'm U.S. born, Harvard educated. I'm not, I don't know, I know the story, but it's frightening to me and to many people that the Gates Foundation has more money to invest in agriculture in Africa than FAO, than the governments of Africa, and there's no accountability. They may think they've got it right, but they're not the ones to decide. They have no right to decide. And there are very vibrant social movements in Africa, farmers, small farmers organizations, peasants organizations, who also think they know what the answers are, and that dialogue is not taking place. And it's not taking place because the Gates Foundation and philanthropy in general is not obliged to engage it. So my question to our two speakers and to the world in general, to the room in general, is how do we turn this around? How do we get what the U.S. has to offer, resources, ideas, experience, et cetera, feeding into building the political process and the political accountability of everybody to the populations in the name of whom all of us are engaged in working and talking and writing books and acting.
Good. Thanks. I'm going to come back. Is it related to this point? Or, yeah, okay, go ahead, and then we'll...
I just want to support what has been said and actually extend it. My name is Elsa Torella. I'm working for the Open Society Institute in global health and in particular access to medicines. And I can confirm that also the Gates Foundation spends much more money on global health than the World Health Organization has in their annual budget. And that is with all the problems of the legitimacy of the choices that are being made. But I want to add one other thing is that the type of strategies that are being supported by typically the Gates Foundation, both in agriculture as in health, are the technology-driven strategies, the intellectual property-driven strategies, the profit-driven strategies, which are totally opposed to the possible community-based strategies that the local agriculture communities may propose, but they have no chance against the market-driven proposals that are being supported, and often with collaboration with domestic companies. Well, it can be domestic both in the US side or the European side. I mean, the industrialized world is exporting their market-based solutions, and that is what I understand without having read the book about the philanthropo-capitalism. That's precisely around the solutions being totally market-driven, and I think that this is a major problem.
Good. All right, I'm going to take a stab here at turning that into a theme, that range of conversation. But I think we touched on, again, it kind of goes back to your metaphor of the ecosystem, because I think the first point raised was really about the political frame and where it came from and its implications through a couple of generations. And we brought it all the way home to New York in the current economic crisis, and then took a segue over to accountability. And I actually think that there is a commonality there, but these are the experts. So,
well, let's talk first about the language. I mean, I do think there's a number of interesting themes that we can pull out of that, which I don't think hang together coherently yet in terms of what the answer is. But I think, I used philanthrocapitalism because I wanted to challenge both philanthropy and capitalism by juxtaposing them against each other and to say, neither of you have got it right in your own boxes, so come together. Another issue is, I do think up until over the last 25 years, in this respect, I think business has, in a number of respects, business has been the most effective part of society. In terms of, let me explain what I mean by that. In terms of, if you ask who's been delivering, the higher quality of material well-being around the world over the last 25 years, it's been the business sector rather than the government sector. Who's been bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China and India? It's been business, not aid or other forms of donation. If you ask, which organizations in society have been the most progressive in terms of recognizing the talents of women and of ethnic minorities, it's been certainly the leading businesses in the world. Where would you most likely to be fired for harassing or preferential treatment towards a member of the opposite gender or same gender? Congress or business, or a foundation? I would say it would be business. Who's the most transparent when it comes to being a journalist about what they're doing? Well, I find I get a much clearer set of metrics and so forth and explanations as to what's going on from business than I ever do from the non-profit or government sector. So that I think in lots of ways business, I think had been actually, leading the way in terms of, above all, what had been the most innovative part of society in terms of coming up with whether it be new medicine, new products, new things to wear, more efficient uses of resources. All these things have been coming out of the business, better ways of us communicating. You look at Iran and the social movement there. Twitter played a big role. Well, Twitter didn't come out of the social movement. It was Twitter was an invention of capitalism and business. All these things have been going on. Now, that is not to say that business deserves to be held up as faultless by any measure, and there's all sorts of long lists of problems with business that we could list. But I mean, I think government, compared to that, has been less effective over the last 25 years. And I think the non-profit sector generally has been less effective in its use of money and resources over that period, which is why, I think another reason that I've said, look, see what we can learn from the business sector that's good to bring in to the philanthropic and government world. That doesn't mean it should be brought in without thought or whatever, without criticism, but I think there are things to learn. And I think for many talented people, government became the least attractive place to be. Business became the most attractive place to be if you really wanted to do stuff fast and not get frustrated by bureaucracy and low expectations and so forth. That doesn't mean that talented people didn't go into those sectors, but I think there was a shift to that sector. And so again, trying to engage those people in solving society's problems seemed to me something that we should be trying to encourage rather than pushing them off in their box. And then we have another issue, which is that there was the reality is that the last 25 years has, like it or not, seen the emergence of greater inequality in society, which means there are all these billionaires around. And it seemed to me better that we engage them and bring them inside the tent and inside the process of solving problems than to shout at them and harangue them and wish they didn't exist, because they do exist. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm in favour necessarily of the economic system that produced them, although I think we can have an interesting debate that certainly I think that in many of the American billionaires have been the product of genuine innovation that they did that produced benefits to society. I can see in other parts of the world where there's much more obvious exploitation that lies behind wealth, but I find it difficult to look at, say, the Google guys and say they've done anything other than make it much easier for us to search and find things that we want to know, and they've become spectacularly rich on the basis of that, and they want to become philanthropists, but they're very hard to caricature in my mind as exploitative capitalists in the old-fashioned sense of the word, or the Russian sense of the word, or whatever. So that's one area. I think that this is a very important debate, and at the end of the book we talk about what is the new social contract that ought to exist between the super rich and the rest. And we set out a number of ideas as to what that might be, and transparency and accountability is very much part of it. But I do think it's absolutely crucial that they are properly embedded in the political process, because they do challenge many of our deep-seated and rightly suspicious thoughts about the role of the rich in society, which have been the result of the fact that democratic rights and democratic government have been hard won over many lives being lost and so forth over the years. So we don't want to give that up. We want to make sure that this process builds on and enhances our democratic rights, but I still think we need to engage in this debate rather than wish that the world were different than it is. The other point I really want to focus on is the Gates Foundation point. And it was quite amusing to hear that point reinforced by someone who works for the OSI, which, as we know, is funded by George Soros, who is one of the heroes of our book. We regard him as the prototype of the philanthrocapitalist. Because he is really aware of how he can play a very unique role as a very wealthy person by throwing his money at high-risk projects where... much like his hedge fund activity, where there's quite a high probability of failure, but if it succeeds in spectacular ways. The Gates Foundation, as I researched them for the book, I was just amazed at how much hatred there is towards this man and his foundation, that he dare trample on the obviously highly accountable and effective world of the United Nations, World Health Organization, and so forth. I mean, give us a break. For heaven's sake, the man could just be spending the money on food and a large house for himself and a yacht and a plane, another plane, art or whatever. I mean, he's actually trying to solve the problem of poverty in Africa and trying to end deaths by malaria and diarrhea, and he's taken these awful, incredibly inspirational organisations like the UN, the Wealth Organization, that have become horribly bureaucratic and unaccountable in the worst possible way, and he's put a rocket up them and he's shaken them up, and the consensus wisdom that wasn't working is being challenged, and I think this is fantastic. And the idea that the answer to the problem would be for less money to be given towards solving these problems seems to be shocking, which seems to be what's advocated. He, though, I think quite understands that the amount of money he has is not very much. So he's given away $4 billion last year was distributed. And that's spread across several initiatives. A large chunk is going to public school reform in America, and then some is going to a lot going to health, and then some now to development. As he points out, $4 billion is only a quarter of the New York schools' budget each year. So he cannot possibly succeed in the goals that he has set without without persuading governments, business, other organisations, mass charities, social movements, that his ideas are good ideas. The idea that he has in any sense the sort of monopoly power that he, in his late stages at Microsoft, was had through Windows operating system, in his world is absolutely nonsensical. I mean, and I just think that as he says, if you don't like it, you can always give money to an alternative approach, and good luck, and we'll see which one comes out best, and the process of discovery will benefit everybody. So I just find of all the things that have been most disturbing in terms of the response to this philanthrocapitalism movement, the idea that Gates giving his money away is somehow undermining the effectiveness of the previous regime of these multilateral organisations, which are so messed up, is the most bizarre to me.
Thanks. Well, the beauty of democracy is that it is messed up, but it's democracy. It doesn't matter whether it's messed up or not. Democracy is democracy, and you have to respect it. Or I guess you can't. So, the point there about democratic accountability stands regardless of effectiveness, because it's about people have rights and rights to voice and participation. Whether they mess it up or not is a secondary question. The second issue I want to raise is about government, because I think this is where Matthew and I disagree pretty acutely. And I'll raise the spectre of neoliberalism, which no one wants to talk about nowadays, because they're ashamed of being called that. But this is what this debate is about. The definition of neoliberalism is the extension of the market into other areas of life. If you're an academic, you've seen that as market economics has percolated into political science and sociology. If you're in government, you've seen that in the new public management agenda. If you're in higher education, you'll see it in terms of cost recovery and so on in universities. And if you're in philanthropy, you'll see it in terms of philanthrocapitalism. So we can put all the cotton wool we like around these terms. But the fact of the matter, and why aren't we just honest about it, some people in society believe that the market is a better way of allocating resources and making decisions than government or civil society. Why can't we be honest about that? And then have a discussion about the real costs and benefits, the evidence, and so on. We may still disagree, but we'll put it on the table. It's much healthier. Because one of the reasons why government has underperformed, you could say, over the last 10 years, is because it's been systematically destroyed by a business agenda and lobbying that don't want regulation or government intervention. It's not surprising that you look there and you see some signs of distress. It's not accidental. And I think that the broader answer I would give to these various questions is to reject neoliberalism. That's my view, my personal view. That's what I believe. Can I cite you chapter and verse that that's the correct position? No. But there's a hell of a lot of evidence, and I passionately believe that what we have to do is take the market out of those other parts of society because they are different. And because they are different, they help to keep forces in balance in society and produce a healthier set of communities and forces over time. You could argue the same way that when society becomes dominated by any one set of forces, you're going to have problems. Too much government, too much business. Maybe there's a society with too much non-profit activity. I've never seen it. Too much civil society domination. I can't imagine it, but maybe it's out there somewhere. Pandora, the land of the avatars. But certainly it's true that throughout history, including in the cases where Matthew was talking about in East Asia and so on, success does not come when society and growth is dominated by one of those three sectors. It comes when they're held in a constant and creative tension. And the story of poverty reduction in East Asia is partly a success story of the market, of global trade and of business, but only under the direction of strong government activism and strong government intervention. What was called the developmental state in East Asia after World War II, or in China and Vietnam today. There is no historical example of successful growth and development which is market-based.
I want to take another.
I guess my question is about sort of the third layer that you were mentioning, or the social impact. And I guess what I'm hearing, first of all, I work at Project for Public Spaces, which is a nonprofit that thinks that placemaking is a holistic way to look at change in cities. But from a media perspective, social movements today are very much part of our media ecosystem. And it's not a fixed media ecosystem, it's software, and we're making the software. So there's this converged situation where the markets, or like Kiva or other things, those are software, social applications that are malleable and made with ideas behind them. What I've observed working in for-profit spaces and in nonprofit spaces more recently is there's varying degrees of anti-intellectualism. And I guess I'm coming from Richard Hofstadter and observations about what society's been like since World War II, when business dominates a lot of the thinking. So my question is, the starving of ideas, I think, is in part because of a lack of, say, anthropology and sociology in a genuine way, where disciplines like that are very human-centered. And I don't see that in business that often, or at all. And I actually don't see that in the nonprofit space done that sincerely either. So I guess I'm seeing, or my critique or question is, isn't there an idea vacuum, and that we're looking at maybe two sort of realms, business and the sort of traditional nonprofit space, that is in need of really profound ideas, a new sense of ideas?
Okay, then let's go to the woman who stood up there. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Arnie Fector, and I work with Mercy Corps. My question has to do with governance and government corruption. So as long as there's philanthropy going into countries where there's government corruption, and then that impedes the aid getting to the people that need it, the philanthrocapitalism model seems to me to be a little constricting, because it doesn't allow space for civil society and natural sort of grassroots movements to make space for the changes that need to happen within governance in order to have the aid affect the people that need the help. So that's my question.
Okay, good. I'm going to make my way up here. There was one over here, and then we'll come across the front here.
Business has done everything in response to a social movement. Business didn't do anything on their own. Women and labor, and it's all about the bottom line. And then even Twitter, I was looking up because I thought maybe I didn't remember what Twitter was about. It was about the inability to really get the particular issue. And I think Iran really demonstrated how there was this disconnect between the public and getting information out in the big media, the big seven, if you will. So I just felt like I needed to push back on that.
Okay. Yeah, sir?
Morris Kramer. Whoops. Maybe back there mentioned corruption internationally. The lady back there mentioned corruption internationally. I think we have to look at the corruption here in our own government, which is controlled by big business and their specialist lobbies. And that prevents us from having our own civil society, although we all go out to vote. I mean, this is what Miles was talking about before. There is something very definitely missing here, which unless we get more of a civil society, we cannot make any of this work, to a decent end.
Say again where you're from and who you are?
I'm individual.
You're an individual. Right. Okay. Okay, right here.
Hi, I'm Dave Aldrich. We have a group called Grab the Torch. We prepare kids for the next generation of giving and philanthropy and the passing of the torch. By the way, I drove from Boston, and I'm not disappointed. Thank you. I'm struggling with, and I'm going to use Paul Newman as a model, and beginning with the book Shameless Exploitation for the Greater Good. There isn't anything bad about what he did, I don't think. From the Newman's Own came the Newman's Foundation, and then from the Newman's Foundation came Hole in the Wall, which started in Connecticut, which is now around the world. And we have a whole program, a whole day we have summer philanthropy camps around the country, and we feature Newman. And he did everything the right way for all the right reasons with no glory. He never accepted an award, a congressional award. He's been asked to speak all over the world. He refused. And he never used his brand to further anything other than just his mission. So he's the model. You go through the market and it's not that hard of a decision. The food is good, and you're taking that money. Only, I think, 8 or 10% of it goes to the camps. The rest goes to the Newman Foundation. So everyone around the world can apply. And his camps, and for firsthand, by the way, seeing what he developed there and his model. And not only did he bring this, I think it's around 200,000 kids have gone through the program, but he created this model for not only the kids, but the counselors and everyone involved to make that step and continue with the generational component of the greater good. So I'd like to get, I don't want to sound like a long-winded sycophant, but he's just got it, I think. And Costco has it, I think, because they quietly walk the walk. There are a lot of people out there that tried to hook onto the Newman's wagon to further their cause, and as soon as he smelt that skunk, they were off the wagon in about a nanosecond. So I'd like to just ask you about that and tell me what you think.
I'm going to just take 2 more questions here, and then we will. They're a little bit.
Ive Rossley. I work for an organization called Endeavor. Actually, a friend of mine commented I work for Endeavor. It supports entrepreneurs. And I've always viewed business people as, and I've personally been quoted as palm-sucking amoeba. And so I've always been very cynical of business. I started out my career working in the government. I went to Bosnia. I lived in Bosnia for 4 years. And I'm glad that you brought up the point about democracy, because one of the things I wanted to make sure I was going out and doing was that I wasn't going to be an international worker in my ivory tower doing whatever I had to do. I went out and I talked to Bosnians. And the one response that I got from them was, you come here and you talk about civil society and you talk about human rights, and look at our lives. We need jobs here. Why can't you bring us jobs? And I really came to the realization that, there are very good efforts. I think that there is validity in the international community going into places like Bosnia or Rwanda and for them to be there. But then the question also comes is, well, then if the people on the ground are the ones who want market-based solutions, who want jobs, then there's this debate about, well, who's making the decisions? If the capitalists are going in there and saying, we want to bring this to you, then, why can't we allow that?
Good. And let's just take one more. The gentleman right behind you.
Thank you. My name is John Morgan, and I do not have the qualifications that most people here do have. I heard some things from all of these previous 4 or 5 people that really strike me as what I feel the crux of the issue and that's humanity. And it really strikes me how these two gentlemen could really actually help each other so much. And you can continue your debates under the guise of debate, but I really feel that from Michael's point of view, there's a secret there that we haven't really felt or heard that could really work with the approach that Matthew admires so much. And nobody's mentioned Haiti, I don't think, tonight, but here would be a tremendous example of how the seemingly opposing views could work in tandem with each other. After all, millions have been spent, and help is already on the ground, but there's so much further to go before this nation supports itself and each individual learns to, out of gratitude, help the person next to them build themselves back into a nation.
Sectors, I couldn't agree more. You know, we need much more self-questioning, much more rigor, much more social science. But the only distinction I would draw is that we need more social science and less accountancy, because especially in philanthropy, there's how do I call it, a sort of obsession with certain kinds of data, quantified financial metrics and so on, which is, as we know, a very small part of the universe of possibilities of information that we can use to make our decisions. So if we're going to head down in this direction and become more rigorous with each other and more analytical, let's remember we need to borrow from all those traditions. There are two questions about corruption at home and overseas, and I'm really glad someone raised the at-home issue, because it normally gets lost sight of. The corrupt people are always over there, rather than a couple of 100 miles down the corridor by train. The response, I think, is the same, is that it's extremely difficult to attack that problem because you're injecting more money into a system which is already corrupt. So any money in a corrupt system will tend to reinforce those corrupt effects. So the only useful thing that I can think of is to build local pressure for transparency and accountability, to link citizens and government together so that people are less likely to get away with their behaviour, and exert political pressure to reform the system from the inside. That takes time, it's very difficult, but it is one thing that you can do, and where philanthropy actually has been quite successful. If you look at the international budget movement for Transparency International and so on, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Thirdly, about Paul Newman, I am a great admirer, you know, although in a sense not because of his philanthropy, but because of the new business model he presented to the world. And you may think those are the same thing, or you may be right. But as I understand it, he took no profits from the sales of products, which is a remarkable change in the structure of capitalism. If you scaled that up, you would have a remarkable change in the social cost and benefits of the economic system. But it's quite counterintuitive, I think, to 99% of the business community. He happened to use the profit for philanthropy, and that was great, but I think the key for me lies in the new business model that he represents, a way of creating wealth which shares the benefits much more widely. That's one of the fundamental problems that capitalism faces, so good luck to him and his foundation. The final two questions, you know, on the example of we need jobs, I mean, that's a perfectly rational response if you have nothing. If someone comes and gives you a sociology lecture about the nature of civil society, I would say the same thing too. You know, what the hell are you talking about? I need a job, I need a house, I need a vaccine. But it's not an either-or situation, particularly in the long term, because in the long term, when people have those immediate short-term needs met or gratified, they move on to other things. And what they move on to is democracy, civil society, accountability, politics, social movement building, and so on. So guaranteeing a basic level of economic security to everyone is absolutely fundamental, and business is very important in that. It's key. And I'm not saying at all that that's not required. And in fact, what I say both in my remarks and in the book is that we have to recognize where business is essential and celebrate it. Creating jobs, okay, go and create them. Good luck, do it, right? But do it in a way which also builds social benefit at the same time. So I don't think I'm not saying you were meant to do this, your example disqualifies the broader discussion that we're having about different approaches to these questions. The final one I want to end on, John, your point about humanity. I mean, I'm sure we are actually learning from each other, I think, as we go. Matthew is beginning to agree with me, so I think that's a good sign. No, I'm joking. We're agreeing with each other. But my plea, and I'll end on this because it's a very important point, I think, I'm not just joking here, is if we're going to agree, let's make sure it's not the lowest common denominator. Let's make sure we are honest and open and rigorous with each other about where we don't agree, so that when consensus finally arrives, it will be meaningful and useful. Because so much of this debate, particularly about philanthropy, particularly because of the power relations involved, is not honest, is not open in that way. And so, oh yeah, I agree with you, disguising the fact that I don't agree with you at all. So, my parting word, and this is really, really important for the future of philanthropy, the debate we started, is that philanthropy has to become much more honest with itself and with others in society. And through that process of honest engagement, we may well learn from each other and forge a greater sense of common humanity, but not unless we accept and own up to where we disagree.
We grew up with, in Britain, under a welfare state and so forth, and very clear parameters and boundaries around every different part of society, and it seemed that this was an interesting phenomenon, and I hope you will read the book with that perspective, that we wanted to write what we saw and really draw the public's attention to it and debate it, because I think it is a very real thing. It's here to stay. This economic crisis has not in any meaningful way reversed the trends or anything like that. This trend is, if anything, accelerating. It's here to stay, and I think, to me, it does challenge a lot of the ways we thought about government and business, etc., how society works, in quite fundamental ways that we need to come up with answers to making it work so that it's accountable properly. The book does end with this very long discussion about accountability, social contracts and so forth, which was our first attempt at trying to make sense of this, but we really do want to encourage debate about that. And so it's great that we've been having that debate. I do find, Michael's, you do make a lot of interesting points, but then I find myself getting, your examples you use to support them often confusing me. You talk about how we don't want more accountancy and so forth, and then you start talking about Transparency International, which is really about, accountability in our world today requires measurement and data. You can't have that without numbers, without asking a question about measuring where money is going and asking how is it. Is that being used well or not? Now the question, right? But the question ultimately is, are we measuring the right things? And I think one of the confusions in the philanthropic non-profit world has been that a lot of data has been what I call defensive data, which is basically about covering the backs of the people making decisions. So they want data that protects them from really thinking very hard. And so they focus on overheads, for example, as a measurement of efficiency in non-profits. And they say low overheads, good. Whereas in the business world, you wouldn't, if you're starting up an interesting new venture in business, you would not think about overheads in that way. So, on the other hand, there's good data, which is about impact, about, how are we improving society through our actions. And at the moment, we are lousy at measuring that. One of the things I write about Michael Greene and I write about in our new book, The Road from Ruin, is that if you look back to the Great Depression, there was a realization at the end of that period that all the data the government was basing its decisions on was useless, and there was a project launched to create national income data to actually measure what was going on in the economy for the first time. And that happened all around the world, and it led to a great improvement in our economic statistics. Ultimately, that experiment ended when, in America, Simon Kuznets, who was the economist leading that project, wanted to include in the GDP numbers a measure of the value of housework, and was not allowed to do so by the Commerce Department, and he resigned. And that now, this crisis, to me, that we're just going through reveals massive problems with our measure of economic well-being, and I think one of the things that we need to do, which is far bigger than just talking about philanthropy, is launch a major program of data generation that is meaningful data about progress in society and whether we're actually doing a good job in measuring what we're doing. I mean, things, and how do we actually get measurements for the right things? And I think that boils down to how we measure the performance of companies like Newman's Own and others, Walmart. All these companies, there is this whole debate about blended value or triple bottom line that is not seriously engaged in by the people who are making decisions, and we need to engage in that discussion. And ultimately, I suppose this is where I come down to the fact that the most, probably very unpopular thing to say, but nonetheless it's the truth. We talk about the capitalists and capitalism as if it's somehow out there and divorced from us, and that the philanthrocapitalists are divorced from us. Well, when it comes to giving, 300 billion a year is given in America. Probably the super rich account for 30 billion of that. 270 billion of it is the rest of us. If you look at capitalism, who owns the businesses of the world? Well, in fact, the majority of the capital in the capitalist system belongs to ordinary people through their pension funds. And the reality is that those pension funds do not take any account of what kind of world we want to live in 10 or 20 years' time. And they're completely unaccountable. And I haven't heard anyone raise that point in any of the debates that we've had over the last 2 years about the economic crisis that we've been in, and how on earth are we going to make those entities democratic. But we are the capitalists, and therefore we are the people who should be setting the terms of the game. And I think that's a huge debate we ought to be having. So that's a bit of a rant about my new book. But nonetheless, I mean, I think it kind of does bring the point home to me that there are huge issues about accountability in society and whether we're setting the criteria. And I think ultimately democracy, our democratic rights, we do increasingly use the market to exercise those rights, or ought to, because we actually have more money under our control, or which ought to be under our control, than people did 100 years ago. And why aren't we using that? I mean, we're using it through our shopping increasingly, but why aren't we using it through our retirement planning and savings and assets in a way that's meaningful? Lastly, I mean, one of the fun things I did this year was interview Ralph Nader, who had a book out that was completely unreadable, but because it was about 800 pages long, and largely, I mean, I think it would be very readable if you wanted to have very specific details on how to change a particular issue. But the book was How Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, which I thought was initially going to be a satire, but turns out not to have been. I mean, really, he does believe that ultimately, if you want to achieve social change, there's an awful lot of great ideas out there that are failing for want of relatively small amounts of money. And, I do think that one of the great opportunities is for those involved in social movements and organisations, grassroots movements, to actually find ways of communicating to those that have that money. And that's quite actually, and if they can find ways to talk to each other, you will actually find that there is a lot of potential out there to actually improve the effectiveness of these social movements by partnering with the right philanthrocapitalists. So I hope that happens. I just want to end finally by saying, unfortunately there aren't any copies of my book here, but I have a website called philanthrocapitalism.net where you can get details of the book. I tweet, for anyone that's interested in, my tweet name is @MattBish, MattBish. You tweet at Edwarmi, EDWARMI. And I do have this box here of DonorsChoose cards. Maybe I'll pass them to the back or something, and they've each got $25 on. Please, the money, I don't know what happens to the money if it's not used, but it's there, and you can help kids in classrooms have projects funded. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very